Time for markets now, and we're talking to this week's analyst about how the recent acreage report is impacting the cattle markets. Plus, we'll get a check on the state of beef exports, and a Tyson plant in Kansas is making some disruptions in the market. What does all of this mean? Dr. Derrell Peel is our analyst this week. He's a livestock marketing specialist with Oklahoma State University Extension, and he joins us now. Thanks for being here, Derrell.
You bet.
And for starters, let me ask you about the acreage report that was released on Monday. What were some of the major takeaways for you, and maybe for some of the folks that you've talked to as well?
Well, you know, there was lots of anticipation of this number. We've had so much uncertainty this summer about the fundamentals of the corn market. You know, we normally know acreage by now. We still don't. This report helps a little bit, although I think you would find a lot of a range of opinions about that. USDA didn't pull the acreage number down nearly as much as a lot of folks thought. So, you know, so I think there's still a lot of uncertainty. That's one issue going forward. If USDA is close at this point in time, then we're going to have a significantly bigger corn crop than a lot of people have expected as a result of all the challenges this year. And that certainly then would take the bloom off of this corn market relative to what we've sort of talked about over the last 6 or 8 weeks. And that would suggest that we had that sort of threat of higher corn prices, which maybe is not going to pan out to be as much reality going forward.
Yeah, kind of give us a breakdown of how these corn prices are going to be felt throughout the cattle market.
Well, you know, on the cattle market side, obviously higher corn prices translates into a higher cost of gain. And I think, you know, relative to what we would have thought, say, early in the year, we're still going to see somewhat higher prices. But the real question now is sort of how much higher. You know, going forward, I think we moderate that from expectations or from the situation, say, a month ago. And so they're probably modestly higher. They will have some impact then on, you know, that bakes back into feeder cattle prices as well. So there'll be some impacts on that going forward, but I think we're now talking about much more modest kinds of impacts compared to what we feared just a short time ago.
And moving on to beef exports for a minute. Beef exports have been in the news, especially with the recently announced trade deal with the EU. So could you give us an overall sense of how beef exports have been and what you see looking ahead?
Well, I think in a bigger picture sense, obviously the EU agreement is good news. It's not a major factor. It's still a relatively minor part of it, but certainly good news and provides some additional access in a tough market in terms of the U.S. getting access. In a bigger picture sense, so far this year, the beef trade picture has been a little different than the last 3 years. We've seen an increase in imports so far this year, although the June imports were actually down, but for year to date they're up a little bit. On the export side, you know, May and June exports were about flat with year-ago levels, but for the year to date we're down just a little bit. So there's a little more challenge in this trade picture, not as helpful as it has been. It's not really a major negative factor, but certainly not as helpful as it has been over the last couple of years.
And something else making news, not necessarily good news here, Derrell. A fire at a Tyson Foods packing facility in western Kansas has the potential to really disrupt the market. So when you look at the numbers, how important is this Tyson plant to the industry?
Well, it's a big impact. You know, this was a huge fire at a large facility that accounts for approximately 5% of our slaughter capacity. So it's a very noticeable disruption. We've already seen major reaction in the markets to this plant closure. The initial impacts, of course, are the biggest, and they will, you know, diminish over time as the rest of the industry, as well as Tyson, have a chance to sort of react and make some adjustments going forward. But it's a huge impact. It's liable to have ripple effects for several weeks, if not potentially up to several months in the market. We've seen something like this before. In 2000, a ConAgra plant in that same region basically burned to the ground and never reopened. And so we have a little bit of history, and there's been actually some research done to show kind of what those impacts were. It does take several weeks to work their way out. One of the things that may be a little bit different this time compared to then is that packing capacity is a little bit tighter in the beef industry, and this plant represents a little bit bigger proportion of it. So that gives us a little less flexibility, but there are several other major plants in that same region. It's the biggest concentration of beef plants in the country. So there'll be opportunities for these other plants to sort of offset, at least partially offset, the disruptions that come from this plant closure.
And finally, Derrell, any other marketing or risk management advice that you'd like to leave us with today?
Well, you know, I guess this shock in terms of the plant fire in Kansas is a reminder to this industry that we're always subject to, you know, shocks on the spur of the moment. They create a lot of concern and issues and so on, but they also really highlight the importance for producers to stay as nimble as possible. You know, for many producers right now, relative to this latest shock, I would say time is on our side. I wouldn't panic too much, particularly for feeder cattle markets. You know, we haven't really changed the overall fundamentals in those markets. So as time goes on, these initial shocks will work their way out. And I think that's a general lesson that we can take in terms of sort of, again, trying to stay as prepared as we can. Obviously, at some point you have to pull the trigger and make a decision, but as much as possible, the more flexibility you can maintain, the better off you may be to withstand these kind of shocks.